Hello, everybody. Just going to wait a few minutes for people to get here. Bear with us. Okay, looks like people are starting to fill up the room. Okay. Any latecomers will catch up. So, hello, everybody. My name is Louis Whitford. I'm the Vice President of the Shaw Island Library and Historical Society. Quick note on the Zoom format we're using tonight. It's the webinar format, so your mics are all muted. However, should you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'll do my best to get to them at the end of David's talk about what Sammy knew. So welcome to the first event of our 2021 speakers series. While I wish we could be together in person, I'm grateful we have this virtual space. Hopefully, soon enough, we'll be able to once again gather as a community to listen, learn, and share stories and ideas. I'm thrilled to have David Laskin with us. For those of you who don't already know his work, David is the author of 12 books, 11 nonfiction titles, and now a novel. His books include The Family, winner of a Washington State Book Award, and The Children's Blizzard, a national bestseller. His journalism has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, Smithsonian, and more. David splits his time between Seattle and the Wallowas in Eastern Washington. At David's Elliott Bay reading for What Sammy Knew, which was a couple weeks ago, there was in attendance a veritable who's who of the Seattle literary scene. I was impressed. I feel very fortunate that he's included Shaw Island on his book tour. One small coincidence, Rick Simonson of Elliott Bay Book Company, and if any of you have been to Elliott Bay Book Company readings or even in the store, Rick has been there since almost the beginning. He knows everybody in the literary world. Anyway, Rick mentioned that many years ago, Jonathan Rabin, our recent Shaw Reads author, said to Rick that he'd recently read a great book by a just published writer named David Laskin. Now that book, which was now about a dozen books ago, was titled A Common Life. It's about 4 great literary friendships. And I mention that because of our conversation with Rabin, but also because David had a long, dear friendship with Ivan Doig, to whom his new book is dedicated. But more on that later. First, let me say a few words about his new book. What Sammy Knew opens in the waning hours of 1969, the cusp of a turbulent decade. Sammy Stein, the protagonist, is 17. Raised in a privileged Long Island home, Sammy is no longer a child, not yet an adult. He bounces back and forth between who he was and who he is about to become. Central to the story, its genesis, in fact, is Tutu, the family's live-in housekeeper, a Black woman to whom Sammy is very close. Near the novel's outset, the somewhat naive wannabe writer, who is Sammy, meets Kim Goodman, a wild, charismatic young woman who is Sammy's equal only in age. Kim is a political firebrand, and Sammy gets pulled into her orbit and spun into worlds far beyond his cloistered upbringing. Before he knows it, Sammy is swept up in the revolutionary political movements of the day, and his actions unwittingly pull Tutu and her grandson Leon into the fray. What Sammy knew and what Sammy didn't know become really important. The novel is fast-paced and exciting. It reckons with race, privilege, and homegrown terrorism. Very much set in a particular place and time, it resonates profoundly with complex issues that haunt America today. The book's gotten almost unanimously rave reviews, including in the Seattle Times. Michael Upchurch called it vivid, with passages both marvelous and wickedly precise. He also called it memoir-like in its portrait of time and place. Which leads me to my first question for David. The book is dedicated to Ivan Doig, but it's also dedicated to Ethel Bean Foreman. Who is she, and how was this book born of her memory?
Well, first of all, before I answer, I just want to say thank you, Louis, for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. I don't know what it's doing on Shaw Island, but here in North Seattle, it's beautiful. And so I appreciate your taking a beautiful evening, which have been very rare of late, and spending it with us. It's a privilege and an honor to be here. So yeah, let me talk a little bit about Ethel Bean Foreman and how she inspired the character of Tutu. So as Louis said, well, Louis talked about Sammy's life, but in some ways, Sammy's situation was very similar to my own. When I was growing up on Long Island in the 50s, both of my parents worked full-time outside the house, and we had a live-in housekeeper named Ethel Foreman. And I was born on her birthday. She was working there before I was born, and I became her favorite because of that. Or maybe that was only one reason, I don't know. Anyway, we became very, very close, and she was kind of a second mother to me, really raised me when my mother was working. Ethel died when I was 10 in 1964. And I never forgot her, but life happened. I grew up, went to college, had kids of my own. I never forgot Ethel, but she was not an urgent presence in my life until, I guess about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more. I had published the book, The Family, that Louis mentioned, which is a history of my own family. And I was kind of lost, really, oddly. You know, as Louis mentioned, I've done many other books, but I couldn't find anything that grabbed me. I was drifting. And Ivan Doig, who was my mentor and dear friend, recommended I keep a journal, and something will emerge. And what emerged was my fascination with Ethel. Just came out of this dark space and this prolonged absence. And I began to wonder, the first 10 years of my life, she was a daily presence, but I didn't know where she was born. I didn't know really anything about her. Her name, her birthday, which was mine. I knew her character, her temperament, and so on, but I didn't know her history. And that was what fascinated me. And that was kind of what dragged me out of this slump. And so I had acquired some very well-honed research skills in researching my own family. And so I applied those skills to Ethel's background and her life. As I said, I knew absolutely nothing. Of course, I went on Ancestry, the go-to place when you're researching somebody, and I found her Social Security number, and which was, I think, part of her death record. And that was the key, really. I sent away for somebody at a genealogical research library said, well, you can send away the Social Security Administration and they will give you the application. And that took a while to come. The application had her birthplace and her parents' names. And that kind of got me going. And I began to really become obsessed with Ethel and her life. I discovered that she was born around 1895 in the northern neck of Virginia, birthplace of 3 of the first of our 5 presidents, all of whom were slaveholders. I traced her family history 2 generations back into slavery. I found that slaveholding family, the last family that held Ethel's family in bondage, and kind of put her life together. Tracked her movements around the South, tracked the death of her son, which she only had 1 child. He died tragically in a boating accident when he was in his 20s. So I completed my mission. And then, of course, being a writer, I decided I had to write about it. And I did. I wrote a kind of a memoir about the intersection of my life and Ethel's life. But it just didn't kind of lift off the page. And it didn't quite come together. And I struggled. I really wanted to honor her. I wanted to report what I had discovered, but I had no letters. I had no diaries, no journals. She had no descendants. I tracked down a couple of very distant relatives. They really either wouldn't talk to me or didn't have much to say. So I had her voice, but I didn't have the words. So at some point, and this was literally one of those moments that everybody kind of craves, one of those light bulb moments. I was walking the dogs. It was November, dark and dreary. I was, this is just not really working. I got to write this, but I can't. And then I thought, hey, I'll make it up. I'll write it as fiction. And it was a bold move, in some ways very frightening, but I decided that's what I'm going to do. And that moment was really that light bulb turned into Sammy and Ethel, and my research into her past, her life, her experiences, that all got folded into the character of Tutu, who's at the center of what Sammy knew. So that's how it happened.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you would read that opening chapter. It's short, but it's wonderful to hear a novel in an author's voice. But also, I think that first chapter, it does so much to establish that vital connection between Sammy and Tutu.
Happy to. Okay, this is how it starts. This is how Sam Stein remembered drowning. He was 3 years old, maybe 4. The afternoon was stifling. Cicadas revved in the tops of the backyard trees like rusty chainsaws. Or maybe they were chainsaws. The air reeked of grass and gas. Quit whining, Tutu commanded in that voice like a slap, but he couldn't. He wanted his mother. He was so sticky that his shirt was glued to his back and his undies wedged in his crack like a damp rope. Kiddie pool, his big brother Tom screamed, and then the even bigger brother Ron screamed it too. Kiddie pool. But why, Sam wondered, would a kitty need a pool? They didn't even have a cat. Tutu peeled his clothes off and told him to step into his trunks. She kept him steady with one hand on his back, her touch soft from the pearly lotion she was forever wringing into her palms. The pool was a circle of blue. A wiffle ball, a plastic bat, and a couple of rubber duckies circled one another on the shining blue surface. Sam jumped through the confetti of light that shook down from the trees. His 2 brothers were already kicking up stars, and Sam joined in, hammering his legs through the cool slosh, stomping, marching, spinning, squealing. All 3 of them were as slick as eels from the baby oil Tutu slathered over their pale, knobby backs and shoulders. Want a duck, Sammy? His oldest brother shouted in his face. Come here, Sammy, get the ducky. But whenever Sam reached for the prize, Ron whisked it off, hid it behind his back, threw it up, and swiped it back inches away from Sam's greasy little fist. On the last throw, he lunged and fell flat on his face in the tepid, bug-flecked blue. He cried into the water and inhaled and choked, his throat screwed shut like a faucet. Still on his stomach, with his mouth and nose submerged, he began to thrash and squirm. And then he quit and lay still. Sam Stein at 17 could not possibly remember any of this, but he did. He remembered it like it was yesterday. While stars winked on in the blackness behind his eyes, a shrieking whoop, my baby, pierced his brain. And Tutu, tall, brown, bow-legged Tutu, who hated to be hurried, came charging across the lawn, elbowed aside the paralyzed brothers, scooped Sam out of the pool, and pressed him, gasping and then screaming, to the gray cotton cloth of the maid's uniform she wore. Sam remembered drowning, almost drowning. But the rest of them, his mother and brothers, only remembered, my baby. From that day on, whenever Sam griped about a bully or a skinned knee or a vile teacher or a devious friend, one of them, usually Ron or Tom, but sometimes his mother, wailed, my baby, and laughed in his face. But not Tutu. Tutu was strict and scary. She rarely smiled and never kissed. She punished Sam relentlessly and cruelly. not with her fists, but with her scorn. But she never laughed at him, even when he deserved it. Tutu was the live-in maid. I'm not your damn maid, she snapped whenever she heard one of them use that word. But Sam knew, had known from the day they brought him home hollering for all his newborn lungs were worth, that he was her boy. Born on her birthday, delivered into her arms by his desperate mother, Sam belonged to Tutu. He and his skinny white ass wouldn't even be here if it weren't for her. It didn't matter what he said or did, how he treated her, or whether he loved her back. He was hers. She was his for good.
Thank you. That was great. So that's how the novel kicks off. So you haven't given anything away yet.
Nope.
Moving on to your other dedicatee. I know we have many fans of Ivan Doig in the audience, and also several writers of nonfiction. So wondering, would you tell us about your friendship with Ivan and the courage he gave you to, in his words, jump the fence from nonfiction to fiction?
Right. Well, Ivan, I don't even know where to begin. Ivan was a neighbor, and Ivan was an idol of mine. And Ivan became a friend, and then a very dear friend, and then a very, very dear friend, and then my mentor. Um, our friendship began when I reviewed one of his novels. It was Bucking the Sun. I reviewed that for the Washington Post, and Ivan responded with a typed postcard. He was a great typer, even after the age of the computer. And our friendship was slow to develop, but it did develop. It became very deep. And Ivan really gave me every kind of support an older writer can give a rookie. And was, whenever I was down in the dumps or got a crappy review or had a hassle with an editor, Ivan was there for me. When I had good news, Ivan was the first person I called because he knew how rare it was and how sweet it was. And we celebrated together. Anyway, Ivan and I had many, many conversations about writing, about craft, and inevitably about fiction versus nonfiction. Now, those of you who are Ivan Doig fans will know that Ivan started his career with two memoirs. The first was This House of Sky, and then Winter Brothers. So Ivan, and before that, Ivan had a career, distinguished career as a journalist. So he had his nonfiction chops. But Ivan jumped the fence, as he put it. And part of the reason he jumped the fence, his first novel, as you all probably know, is The Sea Runners. And the motivation was a little bit like mine with Sammy. He had this great story set in Alaska. He kind of stumbled on this historical incident, but there wasn't enough detail to write it as a nonfiction book, as a history or what have you. So he decided, I'm going to make it up. And that was the genesis of Ivan's fiction. And we did have conversations before Ivan died 6 years ago. Oh, just about exactly. He died in early April. So we're coming up on the anniversary of his death. About whether I should jump the fence. And Ivan never pressured me, and he rarely gave dictum. He rarely said, this is what you need to do, or, if you don't do this. But he said, well, I think you could do it, but it's different. It's very different. And one of the things that he said that I've never forgotten is, well, in fiction, you have to wear your heart on your sleeve in every scene. And I'm still pondering that, but I think what he meant was in fiction, you have to have this emotional availability. The characters, they can't just relate, they have to exchange. Something has to happen. They have to bare their souls in a way. So that was, something that stuck with me forever. The other thing I think that Ivan taught me was even in fiction, you have to get your facts right. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. I don't want to anticipate all of our conversation, but there was this kind of putting on a different hat, using different literary muscles was part of it.
So there's that great passage where it's sort of jingle jangle in my mind, but it's the way that Sam sees New York. So
Right.
just to set this up a little bit, Sam has gone renegade, and Sam is sort of free and footloose, and he is in the East Village. And if you'd read that passage, it's on
I
page
will.
100.
I will. But before I do, I just want to set it up a little bit more. So Sam has run away from home. And as Louis said, he's holed up in the East Village. And I think part of the reason that I want to read this passage now is that I think this is a really good illustration of the difference in my process and method between nonfiction and fiction. So if I were to have written this in one of my nonfiction books, it probably would have been a kind of collage of quotations from social historians, maybe some architectural history thrown in. I mean, it's 1970, we're in the East Village. It's a very rich, complicated part of New York, different immigrant groups. I'd probably talk about some of the immigrant histories, the mingling of cultures and languages. I probably would have had some interviews with people who'd lived through that time. So as I said, it would have been a kind of collage, mostly from other people's insights, perceptions, recollections. But in fiction, threw all that to the winds, and this is what I did instead. The days were getting longer, but it was still freezing on the streets, a cold more pitiless and penetrating than anything Sam had known in the suburbs. There was no place to hide from the wind. Airborne garbage scoured the canyons like flocks of crows. Inside, the radiator hissed morning and night, turning the apartment into a sauna. Sam didn't care. He was enchanted at being free and unsupervised in the city for the first time in his life. The Saturday streets were like a giant polar party. Everyone was wrapped in streamers of riotous wool and alpaca. Eyes peeped from between scarves and hoods, checking him out, challenging him, greeting, inviting, dismissing, lusting, probing. Each block housed a library of stories. On the sidewalk, foreign languages faded in and out like nighttime stations on a car radio. Sam knew it was a tight, narrow island, but the cityscape felt infinite. Brick and stone and glass and asphalt and wrought iron, endlessly replicated in every direction, all of it teeming ceaselessly with people and cars. He was intoxicated and flattened. He wanted to rush down every street, sample every cookie in every bakery, eavesdrop on every conversation, even if he had no idea what language they were speaking. Stalk random, beautiful strangers on their mysterious rounds to clubs and cafes and dark little closet bars and bedrooms humid with flowers and rumpled sheets. Lovers, haters, vendors, buskers, pushers, preachers, crazies, hippies, saints, models, spies, runaways, bums, junkies, flunkies, wannabes, has-beens, washouts, paranoids, poets, rockers, mockers, punks, cons, soldiers, winos, debutantes, and deadbeats, all of them freezing together on the patchwork jingle jangle sidewalk. Sam felt himself spiraling up to heaven like a helium balloon. So no research required, just imagination and letting it rip. And that was something that I loved. And again, I think something that Ivan kind of gave me permission to do.
I love that passage for the rhythm of the language, for all of it. But it says so much about Sammy and what he notices. So in that sort of seeing through his eyes and speaking through his feeling, you define a character in that way. And that to me seems like a seminal difference between how you would have pursued that in nonfiction and how you do it here. So Kim is the Kim kind of launches. I mean, Tutu is the heart of the novel. Kim is sort of what jump starts the action in the novel, and she is introduced to Sammy by she becomes his girlfriend, but she's introduced by this character named Richard, who's again, like Kim, wildly charismatic and also a bull in a china shop character. Both Kim and Richard are way more sophisticated than Sammy. You love Sammy, you want Sammy to be okay, but these two characters are so magnetic, so alive on the page. You know they're pulling Sammy somewhere you don't want him to go, but the way they light up the page and the way they key you up as a reader when they come on, you know it's like, you know, you can't turn your head from an accident kind of. Um, so Sammy, David, well, not you, but also kind of you. There's certainly some overlap in your biographies, but Kim and Richard, where did they come from? And again, you know, even with Sammy, how did you channel your inner 17-year-old to
Mm.
create these characters?
Yeah, it's funny, Louis, that you're kind of linking Kim and Richard. And I think you're right in their effect on the page. There's this kind of crackling lightning that happens. Interestingly, though, they came to be in a very different way for me. Um, Richard just was born fully formed. I mean, Richard, I never had to figure out Richard. I never had to do some of the workshop tricks that I've learned over the years of, what does your character have for breakfast? What's in your character's pocket? Get your backstory, who kind of get inside his skin. I just knew Richard. I don't know why. I think Richard is kind of my alter ego. Um, the me that I never was, very sexually aggressive, kind of pansexual, very funny, very out there. You can't ever insult Richard. He just would blow it off. Um, so he was just somebody I felt that I knew. I did borrow the backstory of a high school friend and kind of glue it onto Richard. So, of course, he's a composite in some ways. I had a really good friend whose father was a record producer, and I kind of gave that to Richard. So, Richard, I've always liked writing about Richard. When Richard came on the page, I had fun. Um, he's outrageous. He's vain. He's shallow in some ways. I mean, Sammy asks him at one point, what's it really all about, Richard? And his response is, drug, sex, and rock and roll. I mean, that's it. Richard is just this hedonist. So channeling my inner kid, somehow with Richard, it just came together. Kim, on the other hand, was much tougher. Um, it's possible that this is the familiar bind that male novelists have in writing female characters. I mean, some do it really well. Others, I think it probably few do it really well. Some do. And I think that maybe the gender thing gave me some trouble. But I think aside from that, I wanted Kim to be this very engaged political young woman who, and we all know people like that, young people who just think they know it all, they have figured out their political ideology explains everything, and kind of sit down, shut up, and listen, because I'm going to tell you how the world is. And so I wanted Kim to be one of those, but I also wanted her to be likable, fun, lively, a feminist, kind of a lot of things. So I was worried that I would turn her into a little bit of a kind of political mouthpiece. Like, she's the voice of the far left in 1970. So there was a lot more analysis that went into her. I think in some ways, channeling my inner 17-year-old was helpful in Kim, because I thought, she's got these ideas, she's committed, she's a radical, but she's a kid. She's deluded. She doesn't know as much as she thinks she knows. She's going to get, and I'm not going to give too much of the plot away, but she's going to cause trouble that she doesn't mean to cause. And bad things are going to happen because of her heedlessness. So I think in some ways, it's possible, I think everybody has an inner age that they feel, even if you're old and wrinkled or whatever, you look in the mirror and you go, wow, how did that happen? Because, inside I'm forever whatever. I think maybe inside I'm forever 17. So it's possible that that's just who I am. Coming back to Ivan, one of the things that I loved about Ivan's work is he does kids the way nobody else does. I would say my favorite characters in Ivan's work are between, say, 14 and maybe 17. Waking up, Last Bust of Wisdom, his last book, has this kid who's clearly heading for a literary career. He's always writing things down and getting people to, put jot little things in his notebook. But he's at that, he knows women are different and attractive, but he's a kid. He's kind of straddling that divide, and I really like that. So I had a lot of fun writing characters. Sammy, as you pointed out, more innocent. Kim, less innocent, but more innocent than she thinks she is. So I think that was a good place for me to be as a novelist.
Well, certainly you can see why Sammy, given who he is at that time, would be wildly attracted to somebody like Kim. She doesn't come off as a political mouthpiece at all, a fully formed character.
Fantastic.
And I obviously put Kim and Richard together because of their magnetism and their bull in a china shop sort of role in the story, but also a little bit as they're kind of id driven to a certain degree. And I'm drawn to characters like that in film and literature who get things going when the action might get a little too sort of cerebral. And here they come. Great. Now, there's another character in here who is my favorite character. His name is Leon. He's Tutu's 1-year-old grandson, and he plays a secondary role. It's not a small role, but it's a secondary role in the narrative. But as the tension ratchets up, Leon becomes central to the beating heart of the novel. So I'm curious, I don't know, is he based on a real life person? Who is he?
Yeah, Louis, it's one of the great joys of publishing a novel, and this is my first novel, even though I've written other books, is how people respond to your characters. And you are not the first who has singled out Leon as being their favorite, or the one that they cared about, or the one that clutched at their hearts. And that makes me really proud, because Leon was a little bit like Richard for me. I just felt, I know this kid. I've never known anybody like him. I did know somebody like Richard. Leon, I just felt he just, again, came out fully formed. I don't think there was any workshopping that I needed to do, or, kind of character analysis or motivation, what makes him tick. I just had an instinctive sense. One thing that I changed a little bit in Leon as the novel evolved, and again, I don't think this will give much away, is Leon lives in Harlem. It's 1970. He's Tutu's grandson, and Tutu has her own place. Even though Tutu lives in with Sammy's family, she has her own place in Harlem, which is exactly parallel to Ethel. And one of my early readers said, he seems too nice. He seems too untough. It's like if a black kid in Harlem in 1970, would need to have a lot more grit just to survive on those mean streets. And so I gave Leon a little bit more grit, but he's sweet. I would say sweetness is Leon's signal quality. And, as I think about this, there are people I've known It's funny. I've never analyzed this before, and I've never given much thought to Leon. I liked him. Again, like Richard, I liked writing about him. The scenes that Leon has, I always felt good when I wrote about Leon. So I can't, I think one of the things that I love about fiction writing is these sort of these finds, these things that happen. You set out in the morning to write a scene and you write something very different. And actually, this is kind of a lead into to the next part that I'm going to read from the book, because this is about Leon, and none of this was planned. Um, I'll just set it up a little bit. I Leon has a great voice. He sings in church. Everybody says, "Oh, you have such a great voice. He could pick up any song instantly. You should become a professional singer." So I have Leon go for an audition. He takes the subway down from Harlem. He goes for an audition in Midtown. The door is slammed in his face, and this scene is the aftermath of Leon's audition, which actually ends up being kind of an audition in its own right. There was a number on the door, but no sign, no name. Leon stood paralyzed until he heard the muffled voice on the other side. "Come, open, it's not locked." He obeyed. Mr. George hadn't exaggerated. It was a closet, just large enough for a desk, chair, and a shelf, crammed with toppling piles of books, tape cassettes, and records. The man sitting at the desk held a black book open in his knotted hands. Leon knew it was the Bible. "Close," the man said, and Leon shut the door behind him. There was a single window, but it faced an air shaft. The sun had never graced this space. There was just enough light from the desk lamp to spark gleams in the old man's eyes, two slits curtained by curling gray brows. "So, new, you want to say, or I should guess?" Foreign but familiar. He sounded like half the shopkeepers in Harlem. The man wore a black suit and a white shirt buttoned at the throat, but no tie. A white disc, like a frisbee, rode the top of his dense, springy hair, the same gray as the eyebrows and beard. The eyes were so small, the lids so narrow, the brows so dense. Leon was convinced the man was blind. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "Okay, I'll guess. Everyone in church thinks you sing like Angel. Someone tells you my son will give you big break, but he wouldn't see you. George in elevator took pity and says you should talk to me." "Yes?" Leon nodded. "More or less." "Come closer." Leon took 2 steps forward. He could see the man's eyes now, ignited coals of fire and ash. "Do you believe in God?" "Yes, sir." "Call me Rabbi. Everyone does, even though I'm no rabbi. No matter. God doesn't care. If you believe, you must pray. Let me hear you pray." "I pray by singing." "Me too. So sing." Leon shut his eyes, slowed his breathing, opened his mouth, and let the Spirit move through him, just like in church. "Wade in the water." He started low. He didn't think. He didn't strain. He let the music out. "Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water." The voice climbed. The air trembled with light. "Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water." He opened his eyes and everything went dark again. Neither spoke, but there was no need. A chord and a chord vibrated and faded between them for the love of God. "Mr. Rabbi," another beat of silence, "could you sing what you pray?" The rabbi put the Bible down gently on his desk. He held his hands before his eyes. His lips trembled, and then a single pure note, like the upper register of a clarinet, but sweeter and sadder, filled the room. "Shema Yisrael." He took an air, and the voice soared. "Adonai Eloheinu." Nasal, almost whining, the note spiraled and spread as smooth as water. Leon, suspended over the precipice, held his breath. "Adonai Echad." As soon as he finished, Leon sang the prayer back to him. blurring the strange words, but perfectly hitting the notes, the sobbing cry, the ancient liquid warbling. He smiled. He stopped and smiled at the old man. I like that twangy wail. That sounds kind of cool. For Jews, our most important prayer, the old man said. Top of the charts. You heard before? Leon shook his head. First time and you pick up just like that? Leon nodded. The old man nodded back. Okay, take chair. There was a gray metal folding chair propped against the bookshelf. Sit. Listen.
Wonderful. You bring empathy to both those characters, and they're people of very different ages and backgrounds, but they really come to life on the page.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, this reviewer in the Seattle Times, Michael Upchurch, wrote, the book feels almost memoir-like. It's vividly anchored in time and place. And, you know, as you picked up on, the events of 1970 New York are integral to the plot. And still, so much of the narrative feels like it was written for today's audience. While you were writing the novel, digging into your lived experiences on Long Island and the East Village and your time growing up with Ethel, how aware were you of the present moment and today's readers?
Short answer, very. I wrote the entire novel during the previous administration. I don't need to say that name, so you all know what I'm talking about. And so that was, for me, a horrifying period of our history, and a period in which I felt a personal upsurge of political engagement and outrage and fear and abhorrence. And I realized, as I was working on the novel set in 1970, that so much of what was happening then was still happening. I mean, I think the line from the Black Panthers, who figure very prominently in the novel, and Kim, who we've talked about, was obsessed with the Black Panthers and really kind of wanted to support them in any way she could. The line from the Black Panthers to Black Lives Matter is straight and direct and has been well established. And I think the tilt toward violence, which was symptomatic of the left in 1970, now symptomatic of the right, the manipulation of media, the kind of using media almost to create a circus-like atmosphere. Back in the 60s, people called it political theater. Well, we don't use that term anymore, but I think it's still going on. So I was very, very aware, and I'm pleased that people have picked up on this, because I think the novel, well, set in 1970, and does not, to my knowledge, have anachronisms, is still very much informed by the political reality of our day.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt, shockingly present, shockingly about now, and yet about this time that was, I was just a baby when in 1970, but I've not been reading about that history and hearing about the history for a long time. And so it was both. It feels like it's speaking to today, but it's very much anchored in that time. And so that leads to, the question, it's fiction, but it's historical fiction. I mean, it's set in early 1970. There's some pivotal events in American history happening. So, and I'm curious, as both as a journalist, that part's easier to sort of imagine, but then when you're writing fiction and there are facts that, as Ivan said, you got to get your facts right. So you got to build a narrative around these facts. So how did you do that, get the facts right, but also put them at the service of your plot and the characters in the novel?
Right. So I think maybe the best way to answer your question, Louis, is to read another passage from the book. I'm going to set it up a little bit, but I think it really addresses these points. So as some of you may remember from 1970, there was a very famous incident in which members of the Weather Underground, this radical group that kind of grew out of SDS, were building a bomb that they were planning to use in an army officers' dance in New Jersey, but it blew up. It went off prematurely and exploded a townhouse in Greenwich Village, took out the whole townhouse, and killed 3 members of the Weather Underground. So this fact, this historical incident, figures very much in the plot of Sammy. So I wanted to make sure, again, as you said, to get the facts right. But I also kind of sandwich it or embed it in a fictional narrative. So I read a lot of, it's funny, the Jingle Jangle Sidewalk passage that I read just kind of came out of memory, imagination, love of language. This passage I'm about to read is much more steeped in research. I read memoirs by the members of the Weather Underground who survived. I read newspaper accounts of the incident, but so the facts are true, but let's just say the envelope is fictional. And so let me read you this passage. And this is from Kim's point of view, the firebrand. Kim stood at the bottom of the stairwell of Richard's tenement building and stared up the 5 flights of steps. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten, but the smell of piss and beer in the lobby made whatever was in her gut heave. She was trembling all over, but she wasn't going to let herself break down like her mother. Mother. She couldn't even conjure her face. Having a mother felt like another lifetime, another girl's life. Kim sank down on the bottom step, crossed her arms over her knees, and let her head drop. But the second she closed her eyes, she saw it. She couldn't blot it out. She couldn't stop replaying it. Where Lee's brownstone stood, there was a smoking pile of twisted beams and rubble cordoned off by police tape and fire engines. Flames shot up through the smoke and sputtered in the blasts of the fire hoses. A crowd was pressed up against the tape, 4 deep, but she shoved her way through. She had to be sure. She checked the street sign on the corner, 11th Street. No mistake. This was Lee's street, Lee's brownstone. But there was no brownstone, just the gap in the building facades like an extracted tooth. A voice behind her. Smell that? Burning flesh. Another. Like a fucking war zone. Another. Cops say it could be a gas main, but these days, who the hell knows? Gas main or pig attack, Kim was thinking. Or maybe the bomb went off by accident? The last time Kim had seen Lee, around 11 that morning, she was in the sub-basement tinkering with a blasting cap. Was Lee's charred body underneath that rubble? A pair of black cars pulled up. The guys who slammed the doors weren't wearing uniforms, but they got waved through by the men in blue. FBI. That's when Kim split. This was supposed to be the day, the night when it all went down. Operation Off, Lee called it. No more firebombs, no more Molotov cocktails. These were the real thing. Dynamite pipe bombs designed to decimate, not maim. They were going to be detonated at an army officers' dance in Jersey. Bring the war home. All the bombs were timed to explode simultaneously at midnight. March 6th, 1970, the start of the Second American Revolution. That was the plan.
So you can see there's plenty of action. So anchored in the 1970s, David, I understand that there's a playlist that accompanies this text.
Yes, Louis, thank you for mentioning the playlist. So the book is full of music. That period was full of music. I mean, we were, we grew up to amazing rock and roll, gospel, spirituals. I mean, this is just surrounding us. I think my own musical experience was particularly rich because of Ethel. Always listened to the gospel music station, and I would come home from school for lunch and she'd be ironing and listening to these spirituals. And so the music there's many, many references to music and lyrics, and Leon is a singer, as I said. So when I was putting together my website, I had this kind of brainstorm, like, hey, what if I put together the Sammy playlist? Like, take the songs that are referenced in the book and just kind of compile them with YouTube links. And turns out it's legal. I'm not, for the lawyers out there, it's perfectly okay to link to YouTube on your website. And it's just a lot of fun. A lot of people have commented on how much they enjoy it. And in a way, once you read the novel, which I hope you all do, if you play the playlist, it's almost like having the novel, the soundtrack to the novel. So it's on my website. Scroll down on the homepage, and you'll find the Sammy playlist. And I have to say, I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. So, at the other thing that's so gratifying is many people are like, "Oh, that was your kid's idea, right?" No, not the kid's idea, the dad's idea. So, old fuddy duddy, but still kicking up my heels.
That's awesome. Fiction. It's new to you. Is it out of your system, or are you gonna go back to a nonfiction? Are you gonna stay on the make believe side of the fence?
Well, I'm so far I'm staying on the fiction side. I'm already about 2/3 the way through a draft of my second novel. I'm not going to tell you what it's about because I'm just a little superstitious or whatever. But yeah, I think I got the bug. We saw Carol Doig, Ivan's widow, the other night. We see her a great deal, and she was saying, "I think Ivan would be proud that you're writing another novel." So it was a risk. It was a leap into the unknown. I was very scared when I finished writing it. I really had no idea whether it was any good. But Louis, conversations like this, the reviews that you've read, have really put a lot of wind in my sails. And yeah, I can make it up and get away with it. So I'm well into my second novel. If any of you are like, "Oh, when can we read it?" It's going to be years. So part of it, the novel, like Sammy, is historical, but it's much, much broader in scope. Sammy basically takes place in 4 months in 1970. This novel that I'm working on now starts in 1929 and kind of goes up to the present. So the research that I'm going to have to do once COVID is over and I'm able to go to places and archives and do all that is going to probably take longer than doing the draft, but I'm enjoying it. And yeah, so I guess I can say I'm a novelist. It feels really good.
Good. I'm thrilled to hear there's going to be another novel whenever.
Good. Okay, whatever. Yeah, stand
So
by.
I have an audience question here.
Okay.
An audience member would like to know more about your relationship to New York. Have you spent time there? And if so, when?
Okay. Yeah. So just like Sammy, I grew up on Long Island. I grew up in Great Neck, which I call Fat Neck in the book. And for a kid growing up on Long Island in the 50s and 60s, New York was like the Emerald Kingdom. I mean, that was the place. Nobody wanted to be in the stupid, boring suburbs. Everything was happening in New York. And so I guess, let's see, I went to grad school. I came back from grad school in 1976, 77, and moved to the East Village, kind of like Sammy. Um, I didn't run away from home. I was a grown up by then, or I thought I was. So I lived in Manhattan for a number of years. Some of them in the East Village, kind of all over the place. But so New York was definitely in my blood. It's still home in many ways. My wife grew up in Manhattan, something that she reminds me of frequently and lords it over me, like, "Oh, you grew up in Long Island." But I grew up in Manhattan. And I remember being a high school kid and going into the city and seeing those city kids riding the bus with their violins and their scarves. And I just, oh, they are so cool. Maybe I fell in love with Kate because she was a Manhattanite. Who knows? It was part of the allure. New York is still very much part of us. One of our kids is there now. She's coming home soon. Kate's mother still lives on the Upper West Side. She's almost 100, but she's cogent and well. So New York is definitely in our blood. And it was so cool and weird to be. You mentioned the Wallowas, so in Eastern Oregon, where we spend our summers, and a lot of Sammy was written there. So there I was sitting in Eastern Oregon, looking out over cattle ranches at snow-covered mountains and writing about grimy sidewalks and garbage strewn, stoops and Tompkins Square Park and whatever, the grit of New York. It was very, very strange to be in this beautiful, pristine Western landscape and back in New York imaginatively. But New York will always be, a part of me will always be a New Yorker.
Wonderful. Co-president on the board of the library is, until the pandemic anyway, split his time between New York by Columbia University
Yep.
and Shaw Island.
That's where Kate's mother lives, right by Columbia University. Yeah, cool.
So I've been dying to ask you this question. By my calculations, I know how the publishing world works a bit, your draft had to have been at Penguin before George Floyd, before the subsequent, the following BLM marches.
That's right.
And your character, Kim's talk of a second American Revolution echoes the rhetoric that we saw when the Capitol was stormed on the 6th of January. Your book appears to anticipate those events. How did you pull that off?
I don't know, Louis. That was a stroke of luck. Well, yes and no. I mean, I think the Second American Revolution talk, I was like, whoa, really? But I think the stuff with Black Lives Matter, as I said, these are strands that have been present in our culture forever. And, one thing that Kim points out in her reverence really for the Panthers is that, I think the Panthers were portrayed to me as a kid in the 60s and 70s as this, they had guns and they were, revolutionaries and armed and violent and had this rhetoric. Well, it turns out they did carry guns for self-defense, and there was very strong rhetoric, but they also had health clinics in inner city neighborhoods, many of which are still going. There was a breakfast program for children, which fed hundreds and hundreds of Black kids living in poverty, free legal advice. So this was kind of community organizing. And also, their name was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And tragically, the need for self-defense in underprivileged communities of color was true then and is true now. And so, some of it was just things came together last summer after George Floyd. I think there was a global uprising, but it's never really gone away. And so I think really that the Black Lives Matter, Black Panther nexus, I don't think was that much of a stretch. I think the kind of the revolutionary rhetoric and I have to say, on January 6th, when we were all glued to the TV in horror, and there was like, people were smoking pot in the Capitol. I have nothing against pot, but I thought, that's what we would have done. If we stormed, we tried to levitate the Pentagon. We thought, we're going to get all the hippies together and we'll all hold hands and probably smoke pot, and we'll end the war by levitating the Pentagon. Now, we were peaceful protesters for the most part until Weather Underground came to be and engaged in what we would now call domestic terrorism. But I think there's this kind of eerie. They were, I think part of what was happening on January 6th was political theater. It was, this kind of acting out. And so I think there's this that freaked me out, I have to say. I think if the left had stormed the Capitol in 1970, I probably would have been cheering them on as a 17-year-old. Now I had a very, very different reaction. But having lived through one period and seeing that period from the point of view of this period, I think really has opened my eyes. And I think that the revolutionary strand in our culture, I mean, we're born of revolution. And so I think we need to take this seriously. But history, we must remember our history. And I think that I don't know whether that will save us, but I think it will certainly save us from making a lot of mistakes.
So I'm curious, the Ethel or Tutu, um, the occasion for this book, and what, to me, makes it so heart-wrenching. If she were alive today, what would you tell her about why you wrote this book?
I would tell her that I never forgot her. I actually did. I found her grave. That was kind of the culmination of my research, and it's really sad. Tutu, we called her Tutu, so the name Tutu of my character was taken right from life. She's talked a lot, and I put this in the book too, about Potter's Field, and she was terrified and heartbroken at the idea that she might end up in a pauper's grave. And so I devoted a lot of time and effort to finding her grave. And I did find it, and she was not buried in a potter's field. She was buried in a beautiful cemetery in Westchester, in which there are tons of people, but including, among them, some very well-known people. I mean, Malcolm X is buried there. Judy Garland was buried there before she was reinterred in Hollywood. Ed Sullivan, kind of big names from the period. So it's integrated. It's this, kind of egalitarian resting place. But Tutu, so I found the grave, but it was not marked. She could afford the grave, but not the headstone. And this was kind of the culmination of my quest, as I said. And after I prayed, I put flowers down, I kind of communed with her, and I went back to the office and I said, can I put a headstone on this grave? And they said, no, only the owner of the grave can. And I said, well, she has no descendants, no family. And they kind of stonewalled me. So I've written about this, and I'm hoping that maybe they would bend their policy. But I think I would tell Tutu, I did it for you. And the other thing is, I think I would say one of the things she gave me, she had nothing really, no possessions to speak of. I inherited her Bible, which I still have. It's sitting on my desk. But I think I also learned from her the power of the voice. She, as an African American woman in our society, and as a maid, domestic worker, very low on the social totem pole. But she was a formidable figure. I mean, everybody, it was funny. I've been back in touch with people from my childhood after writing the book, and they all go, oh, yeah, we remember Ethel. She was so strict. She was scary. And that was impressive. That the power, she never touched, never spanked us. That was verboten, but her voice carried weight and authority. And I think I learned to respect that voice and also to respect the power of the spoken and written voice. So I think she'd be rolling her eyes like, oh, why are you still telling this story? You need to move on. But I think she'd be pleased and proud too.
I bet she would. Well, we're coming to the close of the hour, even a few minutes past, but I hope all of you know that there's a copy of this, of course, in the library. You can get it at any bookstore. those of you that ordered a signed copy, I will get those to you, to the library for pickup for the weekend following Easter weekend. I want to put in a plug for our next event for the Shaw Speakers series, which will be on June 24th. You'll get plenty of notice, trust me. The author is Willie Vlaughton. His new book, The Night Always Comes, releases, just a few days from now, April 6th. None other than Ursula K. Le Guin said, Willie Vlaughton is one of the bravest novelists writing. Murderers, cheats, sadists, showy examples of the banality of evil are easy, but it takes real courage to write a novel about ordinary good people. I would say, the same could almost be true said of this. You'll fall in love with Sammy and Leon. One other note, just today I got an email from the author Jess Walter, author of The Cold Millions, and he said he would be able to join us in conversation later this year for our Shaw Reads book of 2021. The Cold Millions was a Washington Post top 10 book, and it's been, it's a great book, and he's one of our great authors from the state, as is David Laskin. Stay tuned for details on that. So, David, thank you for joining us. Thank all of you in the audience for coming. Good night. We'll hope to see you for the next in our series.
Thanks, Louis. Good
Bye,
night.
everybody. Thank you, David.
Okay. You're most welcome.
Good night, everybody.